One of the things I love about this church is when you hand somebody a microphone, you never know what you'll get. But I heartily endorse your addendum to my comments, and I say amen. Thank you, Greg. And speaking of Thanksgiving traditions, one of my favorites with music is radio stations across the country at noon on Thursday will play Alice's Restaurant by Arlo Guthrie. I'm not quite sure how that all got hooked up, but it happens every year. And we lost Alice this last week. She passed away. Alice, I forget her name, from Stockbridge, Massachusetts, who was the owner, proprietor, and figurehead of Alice's Restaurant, which was a real place. The American story of the first Thanksgiving. We all know it. We probably acted it out in grade school, maybe with pilgrim hats or turkeys shaped after hands and model Mayflower ships. But just to be clear, a dissident Calvinist group that we came to know as the Pilgrims arrived on the New England coast in November 1620. They endured a terrible winter during which half of their number perished. Many more would have died but for the meat provided by local Wampanoag natives. Their fortunes improved during the spring and summer of 1621. Hunting and fishing were productive, and they produced new stores of food from their gardens. In these pursuits, they benefited greatly from the assistance of several natives, particularly Squanto, who introduced them to local crops like corn and to using fish products as fertilizer. This was life-saving because the wheat seed they had brought from home couldn't grow in the harsh New England climate. Squanto proved important in diplomacy as well, and the new settlers forged a relationship with the local Wampanoag. It is likely that the chief, Massasoit, went along with this because he saw the settlers as potential allies in his ongoing conflict with the neighboring tribes. But for whatever reason, a peaceful working relation was attained, and the Pilgrims gained a modicum of food security before the coming winter. A 3-day festival was held in celebration, attended by all of the Pilgrims and about 90 Wampanoag, including Massasoit. The Pilgrims would not have called this festival a Thanksgiving. They were devoutly religious, and they regularly did hold events called Thanksgivings, but they were strictly religious in nature, dedicated to prayer, praise, and often fasting, not overindulging. To unravel this story a bit, though, we must first look at Squanto, whose real name, or at least one of his real names, was Tisquantum. He was invaluable to the settlers because he was fluent in English and understood English ways, as well as those of the natives. How, we ask, did a Native American on these wilderness shores come to know the white man so well and even speak his language? Well, that's probably because this wasn't totally a wilderness. The story began 15 years earlier when Tisquantum, who was a member of the Pokanoket tribe, befriended an English explorer and trader. They returned to England together, and Tisquantum learned the language, religion, and much of English culture. After a few years, they returned to Massachusetts, and Tisquantum rejoined life in his Pokanoket community. Then, in 1614, a less honorable group of Englishmen kidnapped Squanto, and about 24 other native men took them to Spain and tried to sell them into slavery. Somehow, Tisquantum found his way back to England. Rumor has it that it was some Catholic priest that didn't approve of slavery that helped. and I lost my place. And then once again, after who knows what kind of manipulations, made the Atlantic Passage again to return home. On reaching his village, though, he discovered that all of his people had died from an epidemic, most likely viral hepatitis, that they had caught from English travelers. So Tisquanto, the lone surviving Pokanoket, took up residence with the Wampanoag. So he was perfectly located 2 years later when a ship of white settlers appeared at the location, the site of his old village. Indeed, upon discovering this perfect location that was populated only by the bones of deceased natives, the Pilgrims thanked divine providence for providing them with a perfect new home. I can only imagine their surprise when they first met this native man who was familiar with Christianity and fluent in their tongue. Tisquanto also must have felt like a gift from God. So what we know of this first Thanksgiving is now a little askew. It did involve a shared celebration between Pilgrim and Wampanoag neighbors and a time of peaceful and shared hospitality. But we now know that this event was also shrouded in trappings of colonialism and oppression, and that this gathering held portents of calamity for the native populations of this land. As many more ships of Pilgrims and other Puritans arrived on the New England coast, the situation of native tribes deteriorated rapidly. The European settlers believed that they were the elect of God and felt entitled to take dominion over the lands and the gifts it held. War and conflict ensued, often with gruesome results. Mercenary fighters were paid a bounty for the heads of slaughtered natives, and when this became impractical, the scalp was substituted for the whole head as a measure for payment. To be clear, the practice of taking scalps from one's enemies was introduced to Native Americans by white Europeans. The first time we hear of the word Thanksgiving being used for a festival and feast rather than a religious celebration was almost 20 years later in 1637, when the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony declared a day of Thanksgiving to celebrate the successful massacre of over 700 members of the Pequot Nation near what is now Groton, Connecticut. This was truly a Thanksgiving for genocide. It's apparent why some Native Americans and others refused to celebrate our Thanksgiving and instead hold protests, reflected in the plaque that I read from during our land acknowledgement segment. After the mid-1600s, most memory and record of the festival held by the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag was totally lost to history and memory. The idea of a time for Thanksgiving continued, though, and it was kicked around by many. It was a familiar cultural notion. George Washington called a first official Thanksgiving during the Revolutionary War. And after that, annual harvest festivals, often called Thanksgivings, were held throughout the nation. Thanksgiving was finally designated as an official federal holiday by Abraham Lincoln in 1863. And he saw this as a day for celebration and of praise to our beneficent Father who dwelleth in heaven. Nowhere in this thread of early Thanksgivings do we see the Mayflower, the Pilgrims, Squanto, or natives. These weren't on people's radar. In the late 19th century, an old copy of William Bradford's diaries of Plymouth Plantation were discovered in an English archive, and they were published and popularized across America. And talk about things going viral. Everything Pilgrim was trending and captured the public imagination. This was just stuff in like 1890. The newly discovered story of the first Thanksgiving became a compelling origin story for a nation seeking to heal from the deep wounds of civil war. It drew attention to the time when we started and to a shared national history and tradition. Many stories. You take some history, some myth, some wishful thinking, and you mix them all together and create a new national narrative. We exposed our kids to this romanticized tale in school, and we try to imbue this holiday with a special and uniquely American purpose. So, do we appreciate the story, or should we worry more about the human toll and damage that followed from this simple celebration? Can we still be proud of the Pilgrims who did settle in a harsh and difficult land? Or should we condemn the arrogance, privilege, and entitlement that the chosen persons imparted? I hold this story with deep trepidation. It makes me uncomfortable. I feel a real and immediate guilt that we can unthinkingly accept and allow uncritical views that engage part of our own history and glamorize traits that became our greatest flaws. To me, the important information in what I have described today is that Thanksgiving is more than pilgrims. Indeed, the entire Mayflower story can be removed once we realize that it was introduced as an afterthought, an add-on to a pre-existing holiday. And it's not the essence or the cause for our celebrations of Thanksgiving. Because once we excise the oppression, I deeply appreciate taking a day to express gratitude, and the time after the autumn harvest feels appropriate for this. And although Thanksgiving is deeply Christian in its inception, as are so many things in this nation, it is truly secular in its current incarnation. Above all, we celebrate family, connection to others, and gratitude for the gifts that sustain life. And gratitude transcends religions. If you are a Christian, you and your family probably will give thanks to God for your bounty. But the Thanksgiving tables across America this week will be filled in a spirit of love. In my eye, our celebrations involve everything that a church or religion might engage, but with no essential belief attached. Christians, Jews, Muslims, non-believers, and even, or especially, Unitarian Universalists belong equally at a Thanksgiving table. It's a time when we celebrate love, join with family, and seek what is best in ourselves and one another. Either that or we watch football. History, however recounted, must become story in order to be remembered. And story, true or not, can take the place of history if it is not challenged or held to test. How we recall, what we choose to recall, these are choices we make. When we choose to remember something, we imbue it with power, while at the same time, we reflect at the power it holds over us. Memory is an expression of power. The history of the founding and growth of our nation is complex, and it includes the systematic destruction and displacement of settled people. We cannot undo that today, but we should never ignore it, and we should never hide it behind childish stories and pictures. We must commit ourselves to being better, to becoming better, and spending a day dedicated to love, humility, and gratitude is not a bad beginning. Discomfort accompanies us most days. For 1 or 2 days a year, let us remember the goodness and the gifts we share. Amen. Blessed be. Namaste.